The crack of a gunshot echoed through the valley as Mason Wells lowered his smoking revolver, watching the rattlesnake's lifeless body twitch in the dust. It was 1879, and Mason hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another human being in nearly 3 weeks, exactly how he preferred it these days. The Crimson Creek Ranch stood as a testament to Mason's solitary existence, nestled in the rolling hills of Wyoming territory. At 32, he'd built something substantial: 2,000 acres, a respectable herd of cattle, and a reputation as the most unapproachable rancher this side of the Mississippi. Folks in town called him Stone-Face Wells behind his back. He didn't mind, better than them knowing the truth. Mason holstered his weapon and surveyed his land. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, painting everything in amber hues. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, unaware of how their owner envied their simple existence. "Better get back," he muttered to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Commander. The animal snorted in agreement, and Mason swung himself into the saddle with practiced ease. As he rode back toward the main house, memories bubbled up unbidden. 8 years since Caroline had passed during that brutal winter. 8 years since he'd buried his wife and unborn child. 8 years since he'd decided love wasn't worth the hollowness it left behind. The ranch hands kept their distance as Mason dismounted at the stable. They'd learned quickly that their boss preferred solitude to conversation. He nodded curtly to young Jimmy, who hurried to take Commander's reins. "Storm's brewing, Mr. Wells," Jimmy said, gesturing toward dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Might be a big one." "Secure the livestock," Mason replied, "and check the fence line in the north pasture. Last thing we need is cattle scattered across the territory." The boy nodded eagerly and led Commander away. Mason watched him go, remembering a time when he'd been that eager to please. That had been before life taught him its harshest lessons. He headed toward the main house but stopped when he spotted movement near his barn. Someone was inside. Frowning, he changed direction, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. Rustlers had grown bold lately, and Mason wasn't known for his hospitality to trespassers. The barn door stood slightly ajar. Mason approached silently, years of hunting making his footsteps nearly imperceptible. He drew his revolver before pushing the door open with his boot. "Don't move," he commanded, aiming at the figure standing near his workbench. The intruder gasped and turned, hands shooting upward. Mason found himself staring at a woman tall and slender, dressed in men's work clothes with a tattered leather satchel at her feet. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and despite the fear in her eyes, she stood her ground. "I'm not stealing," she said firmly. "I was looking for the owner." Mason kept his revolver trained on her. "You found him. State your business or get off my property." The woman lowered her hands slowly. "My name is Willow Evans. I'm looking for work." Mason almost laughed. "Almost. I don't hire women. You haven't heard what I can do yet." "Don't need to. Ranch work isn't suitable for I can break horses better than most men," she interrupted. "I can mend fences, track cattle, and I'm a fair hand with a gun when needed." She gestured to the holster at her hip, which Mason hadn't noticed. "I've worked ranches from Kansas to Colorado. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Wells. I'm offering skills." Thunder rumbled in the distance and rain began pattering against the roof. Mason narrowed his eyes, studying her. Her hands were calloused, her skin sun-weathered. She wasn't lying about having worked outdoors. "How do you know my name?" he asked suspiciously. "Folks in town mentioned your ranch was short-handed, said you lost 2 men last month." That was true enough. 2 of his hands had left for the gold fields in Montana, lured by promises of quick riches. "Town's 15 miles back," Mason said. "You walked, had a horse." "Went lame 5 miles out. I had to leave him with a homesteader named Peterson." Mason knew Peterson, decent man with a growing family. If he'd taken in her horse, she likely wasn't trouble. Still. "No women," he said firmly, holstering his weapon. "I can offer you shelter till the storm passes, then you're on your way." A flash of disappointment crossed her face, but she nodded. "Fair enough, thank you." Mason gestured toward the main house. As they stepped outside, the skies opened up completely, rain coming down in sheets. They ran across the yard, boots sinking in the rapidly forming mud. By the time they reached the porch, they were both drenched. "Wait here," Mason instructed, disappearing inside. He returned moments later with a rough towel which he tossed to her before grabbing another for himself. "Thank you," Willow said, drying her face. "I don't mean to impose." "Yet here you are," Mason replied dryly. To his surprise, she laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the gloomy porch. "Fair point, Mr. Wells. I promise I won't be trouble." Something about that laugh stirred something in Mason, something he'd thought long dead. He quickly buried the feeling. "You can sleep in the spare room tonight," he said gruffly. "There's stew on the stove, help yourself." With that, he retreated into his study, closing the door firmly behind him. Through the window, he watched the storm intensify, lightning illuminating the yard in brilliant flashes. But his thoughts remained on the woman now in his kitchen, Willow Evans. Something about her name, her presence, unsettled him. Perhaps it was simply that she was the first woman to step foot in his house since Caroline, or perhaps it was those determined eyes that refused to show fear even when he'd had a gun pointed at her. Either way, she'd be gone tomorrow. And life would return to its comfortable emptiness. Morning arrived with clear skies and the scent of coffee filling the house. Mason emerged from his bedroom, surprised to find his kitchen table set with a proper breakfast: eggs, bacon, and biscuits still steaming from the oven. Willow stood at the stove, her back to him. She'd clearly found time to wash her clothes, which now looked considerably less trail-worn. "You didn't have to cook," Mason said, making her turn. "Seemed the least I could do for your hospitality," she replied. "Hope you don't mind that I used your supplies." Mason sat at the table, watching as she brought over the coffee pot. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother, then necessity." She poured him a cup before sitting across from him. "I've been on my own since 16. Cooking work pays better than most jobs available to women." Mason took a bite of the eggs, perfectly seasoned. "So why leave cooking for ranch work?" Willow's expression darkened slightly. "Kitchens are too confined, and some employers expect additional services from female cooks." Understanding dawned on Mason. He nodded, suddenly uncomfortable. "Ranch work is honest," she continued. "Hard but straightforward. No one expects anything but the job done right." "It's also dangerous," Mason countered. "Especially for a woman," she raised an eyebrow. "I've survived this long." Mason found himself studying the scar that ran along her forearm, visible where she'd rolled up her sleeve. She noticed his gaze. "Rustler with a knife," she explained. "He got worse than I did." Despite himself, Mason was intrigued. "How long have you been working ranches?" 7 years. Started as a cook, convinced a rancher in Kansas to let me work with horses after he saw me calm his wildest stallion." Pride flickered in her eyes. "Been breaking horses ever since." Before Mason could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. He moved to the window to see Jimmy running toward the house, panic evident in every stride. Mason met him at the door. "What is it?" "Bull's gotten loose, Mr. Wells," Jimmy panted. "Broke through the north fence. The men are trying to contain him, but Barney's already been gored." Mason grabbed his hat. "Get Doc Williams from town, now." He turned to find Willow already pulling on her boots. "I can help," she said simply. Mason wanted to refuse, but time was critical. "Fine. But stay back unless I tell you otherwise." They raced to the north pasture on horseback, following the sounds of shouting men. The scene that greeted them was chaos. 3 ranch hands were attempting to corral an enraged Hereford bull while another man lay bleeding on the ground. Mason assessed the situation quickly. "Jenkins, Thompson, get a rope on his horns. Rodriguez, help me with Barney." The men scrambled to obey, but the bull was in a frenzy, charging at anything that moved. Mason dismounted to help the injured man, leaving Commander Ground tied nearby. What happened next occurred so quickly that Mason barely had time to react. The bull changed direction suddenly, charging straight toward him and the wounded Barney. The other men shouted warnings, but they were too far away to intercept the animal. Mason braced himself, preparing to shield Barney with his own body if necessary. But before the bull reached them, a blur of movement caught his eye. Willow had guided her borrowed horse directly into the bull's path. With expert precision, she threw a lasso, catching the animal's horns on her first attempt. She dallied the rope around her saddle horn and wheeled her horse, using the animal's weight and momentum to redirect the bull's charge. "Get another rope on him," she shouted to the stunned ranch hands. Jenkins recovered first, swinging his own lasso to secure the bull's hind legs. Between the two ropes, they managed to bring the animal under control. Mason stared at Willow, momentarily speechless. She sat atop her horse, keeping tension on the rope, her face calm despite the danger she'd just faced. Once the bull was secured, Mason turned his attention back to Barney. The man had a nasty gash in his thigh, but the bleeding had slowed. "Jimmy's bringing the doctor," Mason told him. "Hold on." Rodriguez helped Mason create a makeshift stretcher, and they carried Barney back to the bunkhouse. Through it all, Mason found himself continuously glancing toward Willow, who was now helping the men repair the broken fence. Hours later, with Barney patched up by the doctor and resting, Mason found Willow in the stable, brushing down her borrowed horse. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, leaning against the stall door. Willow continued brushing. "Which do you think it was?" "Bit of both." Mason stepped into the stall. "Where did you learn to rope like that?" "Worked a cattle drive from Texas 2 years ago. You learn quick or you don't survive." Mason nodded, then cleared his throat. "About the job," Willow paused, turning to face him fully. "Yes, trial basis. 2 weeks. Same pay as the men. If you can't keep up, you're gone." A smile spread across her face, transforming her features. For the first time, Mason noticed the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I'll keep up," she promised. "And Mr. Wells, you won't regret this." Mason wasn't so sure about that. Something told him that hiring Willow Evans might be the decision that finally disrupted the careful emptiness he'd cultivated for 8 long years. The next morning, Mason watched from the corral fence as Willow approached the wild Mustang they'd captured last week. 3 of his men had already been thrown attempting to break the spirited bay gelding. Now they stood alongside their boss, skepticism evident in their postures as Willow entered the corral alone. "She's gonna get herself killed," Thompson muttered. Mason said nothing, his eyes fixed on Willow's movements. She carried no whip, no spurs, just a rope halter and a quiet confidence that was impossible to miss. Instead of approaching the horse directly, she simply stood in the center of the corral, seemingly ignoring the animal. The Mustang snorted and paced, ears flicking nervously, but Willow remained still. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour of this strange standoff. "This is ridiculous," Jenkins said. "At this rate, we'll be here all day." Just as he spoke, the Mustang stopped pacing. Willow turned slightly, her back partially to the horse, and extended her hand without looking at him. The ranch hands fell silent as the Mustang cautiously approached, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. When the horse was close enough, Willow began speaking softly. Mason couldn't hear her words, but he saw the animal's ears swivel forward, listening. Gradually, she turned to face the Mustang, her movements fluid and non-threatening. The horse allowed her to touch his neck, then his face. Within another hour, she had the rope halter on him. By midday, the Mustang was accepting a blanket on his back. And by sunset, to the astonishment of every man watching, Willow was sitting astride the horse, guiding him around the corral at a walk. "I'll be damned," Thompson whispered, echoing the thoughts of everyone present. Later, after Willow had settled the Mustang in a stall for the night, Mason found her washing up at the water pump. "That was impressive," he said, startling her slightly. Willow dried her hands on her trousers. "Thank you. Where did you learn that method? An old Comanche man taught me." She leaned against the pump. "I found him half dead after his band had been attacked by soldiers, nursed him back to health. In return, he showed me their way with horses before he moved on." Mason nodded, reminded again that there was more to Willow Evans than met the eye. "You've lived quite a life for someone so young." "I'm 26, Mr. Wells, not exactly a child. Never suggested you were." He shifted uncomfortably, unused to casual conversation. "The men were impressed today. You've earned some respect." Willow smiled slightly. "And you?" "Have I earned your respect as well?" Mason met her gaze directly. "You're getting there." Over the following days, Willow proved her worth time and again. She worked from dawn until dusk, never complaining about the backbreaking labor. She ate her meals with the ranch hands, who had gradually accepted her presence, especially after she soundly beat Jenkins at poker without batting an eye. Mason found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. There was something compelling about her, not just her obvious beauty, which he tried desperately to ignore, but her resilience. The way she approached every challenge head-on, the quiet competence in her hands as she mended tack or doctored an injured calf. 10 days into her trial period, disaster struck. A wildfire, sparked by lightning, began spreading through the drought-dry hills west of the ranch. Mason organized his men quickly, sending some to dig fire breaks while others herded cattle to safety. Evans. He called, spotting Willow among the chaos. "Take 3 men and get the horses from the west pasture." She nodded sharply and called out to Rodriguez, Thompson, and Jimmy. They mounted up and raced toward the threatened pasture, where 24 horses grazed, unaware of the danger approaching. Mason focused on coordinating the fire breaks, his eyes stinging from smoke as the wind shifted, bringing the fire closer than anticipated. Hours passed in a blur of shouting, digging, and desperation as they fought to save the ranch. It was nearly sunset when Mason realized he hadn't seen Willow or her team return. The fire was mostly contained now, but fear gripped him as he mounted Commander and rode toward the west pasture. The smoke grew thicker as he approached. Through the haze, he spotted Rodriguez and Thompson driving most of the horses toward safety, but there was no sign of Willow or Jimmy. "Where are they?" Mason shouted over the distant roar of flames. "Creek bed," Thompson pointed. "2 foals got trapped, they went after them." Mason spurred Commander forward without hesitation, riding hard toward the creek that divided the property. The smoke was nearly blinding here, but he pressed on, calling their names. A shape emerged from the smoke, Jimmy, leading 1 frightened foal. The young man's face was blackened with soot, his eyes red and streaming. "Miss Evans?" Mason demanded. Jimmy pointed back toward a bend in the creek. "Fire circled around. She sent me ahead with this one while she went back for the other." Mason thrust Commander's reins into Jimmy's hand. "Get to safety." Now he ran through the smoke, following the creek bed. The roar of the fire grew louder, and waves of heat buffeted him as he rounded the bend. There, backed against the creek bank with a terrified foal, stood Willow. Fire had nearly surrounded them, leaving only a narrow path along the water. "Willow," Mason shouted. She looked up, relief washing over her face. "The path is closing. We need to go through the creek." Mason didn't hesitate. He splashed through the shallow water, reaching her side. The foal was panicking, pulling against Willow's grip. "I'll take him," Mason said, taking the lead rope. "You go ahead." "We go together," she insisted, her voice hoarse from smoke. They waded into the creek, leading the frightened foal between them. The water was only waist deep, but the rocky bottom made progress slow. Behind them, flames leapt across the narrowest part of the creek, igniting trees on the opposite bank. "Move," Mason urged, pulling Willow forward as burning branches crashed down where they'd stood moments before. They staggered through the water, coughing in the thick smoke, until finally they rounded another bend and the air began to clear. On the bank ahead, Thompson and Rodriguez were waiting with the other horses. They stumbled to safety, both drenched and smoke-stained. The foal, once on dry land, calmed enough to join the rest of the herd. Mason turned to Willow, suddenly aware that he was still gripping her hand tightly. He started to let go, but she squeezed his fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. Something shifted inside Mason as he looked at her, ash-streaked, soaking wet, and impossibly alive. Before he could think better of it, he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Don't ever do something that foolish again," he murmured against her hair. Willow's arms encircled his waist, her body trembling slightly against his. "No promises," she replied, a hint of her usual stubbornness returning. Mason pulled back, his hands moving to frame her face. For a moment they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then, aware of the men watching, Mason stepped away. "Let's get back," he said gruffly. "There's still work to be done." The ride back to the ranch was silent, but Mason felt something fundamental had changed. The careful walls he'd built around himself had begun to crack, and it terrified him. That night, after ensuring all the hands had food and medical attention if needed, Mason retreated to his porch with a bottle of whiskey. The fire was fully contained now, having claimed only a small portion of his grazing land. All things considered, they'd been fortunate. He heard footsteps approaching and wasn't surprised when Willow appeared. She'd cleaned up, though her clothes still smelled of smoke. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Mason gestured to the empty chair beside him and offered the bottle. She took it, swallowing a generous mouthful before handing it back. "Quite a day," she said, looking out at the orange glow still visible in the distant hills. Quite a day, he agreed. They sat in companionable silence for a while, passing the bottle back and forth. Finally, Willow spoke. "Your 2 weeks are almost up," Mason glanced at her. "Yes. Have I proven myself?" Instead of answering directly, Mason asked, "Why here, Willow? There are ranches all over the territory. Why did you come to Crimson Creek?" She looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. "I heard about you in town. They said you were the best rancher in the county, but that you kept to yourself, that you never hired women." A small smile played at her lips. "I've never been good at taking no for an answer." "So it was the challenge," Willow shook her head. "Not just that. I needed somewhere to stay for a while, somewhere stable." "You running from something?" Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "Not anymore." Mason took another swig of whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. "You've more than proven yourself," he finally said. "The job is yours for as long as you want it." Relief and something else, something warmer, flooded her expression. "Thank you, Mason." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips stirred something deep inside him. He stood abruptly. "Get some rest," he said, more roughly than he'd intended. "Tomorrow we assess the damage and start repairs." He left her sitting there, retreating to the safety of his empty house before he could do something foolish like pull her into his arms again, or worse, tell her how her presence had begun to fill all the hollow spaces inside him. Spring gave way to summer on Crimson Creek Ranch. The scars from the wildfire gradually disappeared as new grass grew across the blackened earth. Cattle fattened on the abundant grazing, and the ranch prospered under Mason's careful management. Willow had become an indispensable part of the operation. The men respected her skills and work ethic, often seeking her advice with difficult horses or sick calves. She developed a particular rapport with Rodriguez's wife Maria, who occasionally visited the ranch, bringing home cooked meals for the hands. For Mason, her presence was both a comfort and a torment. He found reasons to work alongside her, drawn to her quick mind and quiet strength. They developed a rhythm together, anticipating each other's needs and thoughts with uncanny precision. In the evenings, they often shared meals on the porch, discussing the day's work or plans for the ranch's future. Yet Mason maintained a careful distance, never allowing their conversations to turn personal. The memory of Caroline and their lost child remained a wound he refused to reopen. One evening in late July, Mason returned from town to find Willow sitting on his porch steps, a letter clutched in her hands. Her expression was troubled, and she didn't notice his approach until he was nearly upon her. "Bad news?" he asked, sitting beside her. Willow started, then folded the letter carefully. "My sister in Denver, she's ill." Mason frowned. "Serious?" "The doctor seems to think so. She's asking me to come." A cold feeling settled in Mason's stomach. "When would you leave?" "Tomorrow, if possible. I'd need to take some of my wages." She looked at him apologetically. "I know it's sudden with the cattle drive coming up." "Family comes first," Mason said firmly, ignoring the hollow feeling spreading through his chest. "Take what you need. Commander is yours to borrow for the journey." Surprise flickered across her face. "Your horse, but you never let anyone ride him." Mason shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "He's the strongest mount we have. It's a long journey to Denver." "Thank you." Her hand touched his briefly. "I'll bring him back, I promise." "How long will you be gone?" He tried to keep his tone casual. "I don't know. Weeks, maybe longer if she needs care." Mason nodded, his jaw tight. "Your position will be waiting, however long it takes." Willow studied him, her expression unreadable. "You've become a good friend, Mason Wells." Friend, the word should have pleased him. Instead, it felt like a stone in his gut. "Safe travels," he said gruffly, rising to his feet. "I'll have Rodriguez prepare provisions for your journey." Before she could respond, he walked away, needing distance from the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He paced his room, fighting the realization that had been growing for months. Willow Evans had become essential to him not just as a worker, but as a companion. The thought of the ranch without her presence left him cold, but deeper than that was the fear. The last time he'd allowed himself to love someone, he'd lost everything. The pain had nearly destroyed him. Could he risk that again? By dawn, Mason had made a decision. He would say nothing, do nothing. Willow would go to her sister, and he would continue as before. It was safer that way. For both of them. He waited on the porch as she prepared to depart, Commander saddled and loaded with provisions. The ranch hands had gathered to see her off, evidence of how thoroughly she'd become part of their small community. "I've included extra bandages and medicine," Maria was saying, handing Willow a small package. "For your sister." Willow embraced the woman warmly. "Thank you, Maria, I'll write when I can." She said her goodbyes to each of the men, accepting their well wishes with grace. Finally, she approached Mason, who stood rigid at the bottom of the steps. "I guess this is goodbye for now," she said softly. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Willow hesitated, then stepped forward and kissed his cheek. "Take care of yourself, Mason." Something broke loose inside him at the touch of her lips against his skin. As she turned to mount Commander, Mason found himself reaching for her arm. "Willow, wait." She looked back, questioning, words failed him. Instead, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, desperately, pouring 8 years of loneliness and fear and newfound hope into the contact. For one terrible moment, she stiffened in surprise. Then her arms wound around his neck, and she was kissing him back with equal fervor, heedless of the ranch hands watching in shocked silence. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Mason pressed his forehead against hers. "Come back to me," he whispered, the words raw with emotion. "Please." Willow's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I will, I promise." It was the longest autumn of Mason's life. The cattle drive to Cheyenne went smoothly, bringing a handsome profit that should have pleased him. But as he rode back to Crimson Creek, all he could think about was Willow. Her letters arrived sporadically. Her sister was improving, but slowly. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. She missed the ranch, the work, the big Wyoming sky. She missed him. Mason read each letter until the paper grew soft at the folds, then carefully stored them in his desk drawer. He wrote back awkward, halting letters at first, then gradually more open as he shared the daily happenings of the ranch and, eventually, his feelings. It was in writing that he finally told her about Caroline, about the baby they'd lost, about his years of self-imposed isolation. He described how Willow had brought life back to the ranch and to him, how the thought of her return both terrified and sustained him. September turned to October, and the first snow dusted the mountains. Still, Willow remained in Denver. Mason threw himself into winter preparations, working from dawn until well after dusk. The physical exhaustion helped him sleep, at least. It was early November when Jimmy came racing into the barn where Mason was repairing tack. "Rider coming," the boy announced excitedly. "I think it's Miss Evans." Mason dropped everything and strode outside, his heart pounding. Through the crisp autumn air, he could make out a familiar figure approaching on a buckskin horse. He walked to meet her, stopping at the edge of the yard. As she drew closer, he could see that she looked tired but well. Commander pranced beneath her, clearly pleased to be home. Willow reined in before him, a smile spreading across her face. "Hello, Mason, your sister," he asked immediately, much improved. "My aunt has moved to Denver to help care for her." She swung down from the saddle, standing before him. "I came home as soon as I could." Home, the word hung in the air between them. "I got your letters," she continued when he remained silent. "All of them." Mason nodded, suddenly uncertain. "And?" Willow stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "And I love you too, Mason Wells. Have since that day in the creek when you came through the smoke to find me." The admission, spoken so plainly, broke the last of Mason's reservations. He pulled her into his arms, breathing in the scent of her, feeling the solid reality of her presence. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back," he confessed against her hair. Willow leaned back to look at him. "I will always come back to you." Their second kiss was gentler than the first, a promise rather than a desperate plea. When they parted, Mason kept his arm around her waist as they walked Commander to the stable. "The ranch has missed you," he said, unable to stop smiling. Willow laughed. "Just the ranch." "Maybe I missed you a little too." "A little." Mason stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Willow Evans, you brought life back to a man who thought he was done living. I missed you with every breath." Her expression softened. "I'm here now, for as long as you'll have me." "Forever then," Mason replied, meaning it with his entire being. Mason and Willow were married that Christmas in the town church, with the entire Crimson Creek ranch in attendance. Snow fell gently outside as they exchanged vows, promising to face whatever life brought them together. Spring brought new calves, summer brought abundant crops, and autumn brought their first child, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's serious eyes. They named her Hope for what Willow had restored to Mason's life. The years passed, the ranch prospered, and 2 more children joined their family, a son named Daniel and another daughter called Lily. Mason and Willow worked side by side, partners in every sense, building a legacy that extended far beyond cattle and land. Sometimes, visitors to Crimson Creek Ranch would marvel at the unusual sight of husband and wife working as equals, breaking horses, driving cattle, making decisions about the ranch's future. Folks in town still talked about how the infamous stone-face Wells had been transformed by love. Mason didn't mind the talk. Each night, as he held Willow close, he thanked whatever twist of fate had led her to walk into his barn that stormy day. The man who had once sworn off love had found, in the end, that it was the only thing truly worth having. On their 20th anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play with the ranch dogs, Willow squeezed Mason's hand. "Any regrets?" she asked, her green eyes still bright with the spirit that had captivated him all those years ago. Mason shook his head, bringing her fingers to his lips. "Not a single one." And as the Wyoming sun set over Crimson Creek Ranch, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Mason Wells knew with absolute certainty that the greatest risk he'd ever taken, opening his heart again, had brought him the greatest reward of all.